Climate change, food security, and financial architecture. The policies connecting banks and other financial institutions. Those were the key issues discussed at a major summit in the Dominican Republic. Hello, I'm Mike Walter, filling in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. Leaders from across Latin America gathered in Santo Domingo for the 28th Ibero-American Summit. Over the weekend, delegations from 22 Spanish and Portuguese-speaking nations agreed on 4 proposals under this year's theme, Together for a Fair and Sustainable Ibero-America. CGTN's Frank Contreras reports on these latest developments.
Heads of state from across Latin America attended this weekend's Ibero-American Summit, including Cuban leader Miguel Díaz-Canel, Chilean President Gabriel Boric, the King of Spain, Philip VI, and the President of Honduras, Xiomara Castro. Notably absent from the high-level gathering, the presidents of Brazil and Mexico, Latin America's 2 largest economies. Both countries sent regional-level diplomats. The main agenda centers around economics, specifically how to create regional financing and make credit more accessible in Latin America.
With so much concentrated wealth and so much speculation, we must understand that the current financial system must not receive more support. We must change it drastically.
Another concern, rising regional food prices, which often leave the poorest struggling to feed their children. The United Nations reports that Latin Americans pay more than any other region for the cost of a healthy meal. The global impact of climate change was also a major topic at the summit. Leaders are signing a joint Ibero-American environmental charter. Among other things, it would take steps to protect natural lands and oceans in Latin America. Other items at the summit include how to produce better access to the internet and computer technology across the region. Immigration was also on the agenda. The president of Paraguay, Mario Abdo Benitez, told his counterparts that Latin America is experiencing a migration crisis, one of the largest ever. Frank Contreras, CGTN.
To discuss this and more, let's bring in our guest. Joining us from Mexico City, Laura Carlsen is the director of the Americas program. From Nicaragua, Benjamin Norton is an investigative journalist and editor of Multipolarista, an independent news website. Out of San Francisco, Gloria Riva is coordinator of the Cuba and Venezuela Solidarity Committee in the United States. And from Sao Paulo, Sergio Lima is a senior Brazil analyst at Medley Global Advisors. Welcome all of you to the show. Mario, they talked about fairness and sustainability. There's a lot on the agenda. Can you talk to us about what was accomplished?
Well, as you've mentioned in the story, Brazil wasn't represented by its president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Lula had an official trip to China, but he had to cancel also because of his health condition. So, despite not having like the leadership present, Brazil is very keen on bringing this sort of discussion, especially sustainable development, which is one of the major key points of this government in terms of bringing investments back to Brazil and also to strengthen its position here in Latin America.
Laura, let me ask you about one of the concerns that was expressed at this gathering, which was basically Dominican Republic's neighbor, Haiti, where we're still seeing a lot of political turmoil, increasing gang violence there, as you know. It was something that was brought up in the discussion, and kind of remarkable. It happened just a few days after U.S. President Joe Biden was in Ottawa, also talking with the Prime Minister there, Justin Trudeau, about this very same issue. It doesn't seem, though, like anyone has a real good solution on how to address this. Was there any consensus here? And how was did they move the ball forward at all in terms of coming up with some kind of solution for Haiti?
I think the short answer to that, Mike, is no, because as you know, this kind of a meeting depends on consensus on all issues. And so you look at the declaration, you look at the charters that were agreed to during this meeting, and they're very general. And so the point 29 of the declaration, what it expresses is a profound concern over Haiti. And that doesn't mean that there's not going to be bilateral, that there's not going to be follow-up in terms of what the individual nations do, but there's already an international concern over Haiti. There's already a number of processes going on. I'm not sure that this really adds anything to it. The most important concern there is that there is still no recognition on the part of the international community at large of the role that it has played in the current crisis in Haiti. And what we're seeing are almost all military solutions, which we know perfectly well have not worked in the past. So while everyone's wringing their hands over the dilemma, over the tragedy in Haiti, we're not seeing a lot of foreign movement, and we didn't see it at this summit either.
It's so interesting when you mentioned that. I saw three heads nodding in agreement. We don't usually see that on the Heat. Let me ask you about, you talked about consensus. One other thing that also is important when you have gatherings like this is attendance. And this year's summit, there were a lot of absences. I mean, Mexico, Nicaragua, Panama, El Salvador, Guatemala, Venezuela's Maduro, as Mario was mentioning, Lula da Silva, both of them ill. And Peru's president, of course, can't leave unless he gets the consent of Congress. So how effective can a gathering like this be when there were so many absences?
Well, this particular summit was basically gutted by the absence of high-level representatives of the most powerful countries in Latin America. You know, we saw a very strong representation of the colonizers, you know, of Spain and of Portugal and of the European region. But the other countries, there were individual excuses, but there's also a sense that this particular space may be becoming obsolete. Because even when they talked about more specific commitments, they talked about presenting them in other forums, like the Community of Latin American States, of Latin American Caribbean states, and having a follow-up forum on migration. They're basically duplicating a lot of efforts and a lot of principles and a lot of declarations that are happening in other places. And while many of those, especially progressive countries in Latin America, do see this maintenance of relationships with the European countries, in this case Spain and Portugal, as important to their anti-hegemonic moves in the diplomatic field, especially against U.S., obviously United States hegemony. This particular forum is not a place where you're going to find a lot of emphasis on concrete solutions.
Ben, I think you'd probably agree that it's not a good sign when the colonizers are well represented and not the others. Let me ask you about El País. They reported on the summit. They wrote this, we'll put it up on the screen. The success of the summit lies in its acceptance that while governments in the region do not share the same ideology, they share a common destiny. However, there continue to be political divides, and unlike before, they no longer fall down clear left versus right lines. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, of course, El País is the representation of the Spanish ruling class, so we know what their perspective is, and they're encouraging divisions within the Latin American left. I read their reporting on the summit, and they have been really pushing this talking point very hard, although as someone who lives in the region, this is exaggerated. There are differences among the left, but the differences are much bigger between the left and the right. The difference is that right now in Latin America, the vast majority of the governments do have left-wing presidents. But I think what this also reflects is, I looked very carefully at the Spanish language reporting of this summit, and the vast majority was in Spain's newspapers, not in the region's newspapers in Latin America. And it reflects the fact that this summit is largely a formality, and it's really pushed by the European powers, mostly Spain, to a lesser extent Portugal, which is the whole concept of Ibero-America is something that the Spanish right wing, including the far right, like the neo-Francoist parties like Vox, have been talking a lot about. In Latin America and the Caribbean, the discussion is much more about regional integration. And Laura mentioned something important, which is the CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. And that summit that was recently held in Argentina that brought together Lula and other leaders in the region was significantly more important. That represents the future of the region, not this summit. That explains why there were so many absences from leaders across the region, because clearly they don't see this summit as something that's a top priority for them.
Mario, I see you nodding your head. Do you want to jump in?
Yes, that's right, and this is becoming very clear in this Lula government. He really wants to reestablish the sort of regional integration that was like a mark in his first 2 terms. He's putting a lot of emphasis on Mercosur, but also, like mentioned, on CELAC. That was actually it was so important for Lula that he actually preferred that meeting instead of talking to other countries at that moment. So the emphasis on regional integration is a key aspect of this Brazil administration. I still think that there's a lot to be achieved in terms of not only regional integration, but also in terms of reestablishing the discussions and contacts between Brazil, especially Brazil and Mexico, the 2 largest economies. But you can clearly see that this is the trend that Brazil, as a regional leader, as an economic power in the region, is trying to galvanize, starting with this new government.
Gloria, I'm going to get to you in just a minute. I just want to ask a follow-up of Benjamin. Let me ask you about this. The Chilean president took jabs at Nicaragua during the summit. We also saw tensions between Mexico and Spain and Central American countries and Spain. These stark divides on display, what do we read into those?
Well, Boric in Chile has been suffering from a very low approval rating. Recently in January, it was 26%. And he has tried to distract from a lot of his failures at home by blaming other governments in the region, especially Nicaragua, but also Venezuela. And I mean, this has been Boric's strategy. I think it's much more insightful to see what the new president in Colombia had said, Gustavo Petro. He talked about the hypocrisy of the West, which constantly criticizes Venezuela and also Nicaragua, and yet refuses to acknowledge some of its own crimes, especially Spain really pushed hard in this summit to try to pressure the region to sign an agreement denouncing Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the vast majority of the countries in the region have been neutral over this. One of the only leaders in the region who has taken the side of NATO is Boric in Chile, which explains his position on Nicaragua as well. He's cozying up to the United States. But the reality is that despite Spain's best efforts, the best they could get, instead of a statement condemning the Russian invasion, there was a very vague statement saying that Latin America, the entire region and Spain, that they want world peace, which of course everyone wants world peace, but it represents the fact that, as Gustavo Petro said, why are we only condemning one country's war, that is the proxy war between Russia and NATO in Ukraine, and not condemning, for instance, the US war in Iraq? Petro specifically mentioned that why don't we talk about all of the wars waged for oil? And he didn't mention the United States, but everyone knew when he said that he was referring to the United States. So Boric is a rare exception. Excluding him, the vast majority of leaders in the region now can see the double standards, and that's why they're so reticent to take a firm position condemning Russia when they recognize that what they're simply doing is falling into a trap if they do that, and instead they want to recognize that the U.S. is even more responsible for warmongering around the world.
Well, Gloria, there were some other jabs directed at the United States. I was going to read one of them to you just right now. The Cuban foreign minister with sharp words for the United States. Let me share with you what he had to say. We are confident that this meeting in the Dominican Republic will demonstrate the firm rejection of the arbitrary and unilateral U.S. classification of our country as a sponsor of terrorism, and we hope we can count on the traditional and valuable support of Ibero-America over the just demand to end this criminal and illegal blockade imposed against the Cuban people, intensified to unprecedented extremes during the pandemic. Did he find a sympathetic audience there to his complaints about the United States and the embargo?
Oh, yes. There were 2 unanimous statements, very rare in this summit, of one opposing the U.S. unilateral measures, the blockade, as well as the false label of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. Everybody knows that Cuba is a victim of U.S.-sponsored terrorism. But I think I'm glad that you mentioned the United States, because in addition to the centuries of colonization by Spain, Portugal, is really the continued decades of U.S. domination, the enormous impact that the U.S. continues to have in the whole region, and why it is that, for example, CELAC has such an important role today in excluding the United States and Canada in this region. But in addition, I think that the situation of Haiti cannot be overlooked. The fact that this took place in Dominican Republic and the Haitian people continued to suffer deportations from Dominican Republic seeking some economic relief, and the fact that there are troops, the MINUSTA forces in Haiti, as well as Canadian that have been added there, and the fact that 600 people have died in Haiti since October because of cholera, something that the United Nations refuses to address financially and into bringing some relief to the water supply of Haiti. The fact that troops is the only kind of answer, and that Costa Rica was demanding military action in Haiti. I also want to say something about Brazil. Brazil is coming out now of this tragedy of Bolsonaro, the dictator, who continued to destroy the Amazon in frightful numbers, and that now that it's recognized that the Yanomami tribe, the last really unaffected tribe, is at the stage of dying because of the mining and so on. So hopefully within that country, Brazil, this policy will be reversed. But I think overall, the fact that Mexico has played such a big role in supporting Cuba and saying that he will lead, AMLO will lead a campaign against the blockade, shows a real shift of certain countries, Mexico principally, as well as demanding the end of the sanctions of Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba.
Mexico's moves on the blockade, you brought them up. I mean, when you think about the blockade, this dates back to John F. Kennedy, I mean, the 1960s. It's just remarkable that it's still in place. Why is that, do you think?
Because the United States sees a great danger in Cuba's social policy of socialism. They are terrified about the fact that Cuba is a shining example to the world of its medical work. The U.S. has a policy called the Cuban Medical Professional Parole Act. In addition to U.S. officials having called the 23,000 Cuban doctors providing free healthcare in Venezuela, calling them military officials, intelligence officials, or that Cuban doctors are enslaved, which is completely false, the U.S. is trying to destroy the one thing that the world knows about Cuba, that it provides free healthcare not only to its people, but to the world in the most difficult humanitarian circumstances, from fighting Ebola to the COVID crisis. And I think that one example, in addition to the whole blockade, shows that the U.S. fears the example of socialism. It's why they destroyed, I mean, this is the anniversary in March of the coup in Argentina against tens of thousands of leftist youth who were butchered, murdered, because they had an example like Cuba. You look throughout Latin America, how many socialist revolutions, progressive revolutions, would have relieved the whole continent and for the world if it hadn't been for U.S. intervention, coup, sanctions that continue to this day. It's not only the summit of Ibero-American Summit, but 183 countries have voted against the U.S. blockade of Cuba. Only Israel stands with the U.S.
Mario, as Gloria pointed out, you know, we've seen destruction in the Amazon, and they're referred to as the lungs of the globe. Several issues were addressed at the summit. One was climate change. Let's listen to the sense of urgency from Colombia's president.
Esas proyecciones que hacen los científicos.
If we do nothing, scientists project we will turn a big part of this political space, this meeting here today, into an unavailable place on Earth by 2070. Our grandchildren in 2070 wouldn't be able to live in our countries. This is the effect of the climate crisis if things stay the same.
So, Mario, give me an idea of something that they did agree to, which is called the Green Pact. What kind of impact do you see that having, and what were the contours of that?
Well, looking at, I think it's an important step, but I don't think that it's the definitive. But the importance to me is like people are starting to pay attention and look into that direction and also see how important it is, not only for global preservation, but also for the own countries. It's important for them to actually put a stamp into global economy. Also, I think it's not a secret that probably the growth in China that we're expecting this to resume this year is going to be way more greener than it was in the past. And that brings a lot of opportunities also for the countries here in the region. Not only we have what we call like the lungs of the world in terms of the Amazon, but also you have a lot of possibilities here. But it's important that, especially just focusing here now on Brazil, it's a new way of looking into this subject, as preservation is not against economic development. So you're not going to increase the development by dropping trees, or when Gloria mentioned also the Yanomami crisis in Brazil, you're not going to improve your stake in the world by destroying people, civilizations, destroying forests. So I think in that sense, the discussion being put up, I only see it as positive, not only in social terms, and not only in environmental terms, but also in terms of economic development.
Laura, let's talk a little bit about the issue of economic matters, because that also was on the table. Let's listen to the Venezuelan foreign minister.
We must achieve the necessary agreements to influence and count on an international financial system that is fair, a system focused on development instead of politicalization and lack of respect. Enough of excluding countries from the financial system based on hate, ideology, and political intolerance.
Laura, let me get your reaction to what he had to say.
Well, he's absolutely right. And of course, his country has suffered the sanctions of the United States, and there are sanctions in other parts of the world. And at this point in human history, if we should know anything, it's that sanctions only punish populations, the most vulnerable parts of populations, especially women and children, who are becoming the victims of these types of economic wars, and also of the types of wars that are now killing more civilians. So one of the agreements is to seek out a more fair, inclusive financial system. But the most discord and the most difficult point of the whole summit was trying to come to an agreement on that financial letter. And in fact, it came out as something, again, very watered down, without specific commitments or those kinds of things. You know, when we talk about the environment or the financial system, while you can call the rhetoric positive, the lack of really moving forward, of pushing the envelope on such critical issues, and especially when you're face to face with developed countries and the Latin American countries, the poorer countries that have suffered the colonization and the neocolonialism of the developed countries, you have to come to a point at some place where you say there's trade-offs. Yes, you can conceive of development that doesn't affect the environment, but unless those developed countries, including Spain, including Portugal, come to the point where they say, we are benefiting from extractive industries in Latin America that are promoting climate change and causing social conflict. Therefore, we are going to change our investment models and a large part of the international financial system. You're not really going to make progress. So unless you put those hard issues on the table, if you insist on having a meeting between the developed countries and between Latin America, you know, unless they're willing to put those issues on the table, there's really no point, because there's not much room to move forward, because this kind of El País rhetoric of like, okay, we're all one big community, what they called it the syncretism that we've enjoyed for the past more than five centuries. You know, if you say that to indigenous peoples here in Latin America, they're going to be very offended. The whole framework that somehow there's no conflict of interest within this group of countries is a farce, and I think that's the biggest limitation of this summit.
Well, you know, Ben, Laura brings up the suffering, and you look at income inequality between developed countries and countries that, like these that we're discussing. You know, you just kind of see it not improving when you look at the digital divide. I mean, I've talked to a lot of officials in these countries who say, look, you know, everybody else is talking about 5G and AI, and we're talking about, boy, it'd be nice if we get the internet and some computers. I mean, talk to us about that, this digital divide that's also very dramatic.
Well, the reality is that inequality between the wealthy, formerly colonial countries and the formerly colonized countries is getting worse, not better. There's this Steven Pinker idea we constantly hear that the world is moving, you know, the arc of justice is bending, you know. That's ridiculous. Actually, the reality is that inequality is getting worse in many different strata, not just in terms of the digital divide. And we should understand that, you know, formal colonialism ended, but many of those kinds of neo-colonial policies continue. Gustavo Petro made a very important point, the Colombian president, that there should be a president here, but he is a prisoner right now. And he was referring to Pedro Castillo, the elected president of Peru, who was the first representative of impoverished indigenous descent Peruvians in the presidency in decades. He was overthrown in a coup by a right-wing controlled Congress that has a 7% approval rating, and he was imprisoned without trial for 18 months. And the United States and the European countries have strongly supported this coup, given the rubber stamp to the unelected Peruvian regime, which has killed dozens of protesters, largely from rural indigenous majority areas. And that is the perfect embodiment, the symbol of the problem that we're talking about here, which is that this problem, these neo-colonial policies continue, and the reality is that if there is a president who is elected democratically by poor and working people, many of indigenous descent, like in Peru, there is the very real possibility that president could be overthrown in a coup. What were Pedro Castillo's proposals for his policies? They weren't radical. He wasn't talking about expropriating wealth, expropriating the foreign mining corporations. He wanted to expand education, healthcare, access to potable water, electricity, affordable housing, very basic measures. And yet he was overthrown in this coup that was supported by the same powers now that are sponsoring this summit and telling everyone to just hold hands and get together. Again, it represents that there are many more differences between the countries in the region and Spain than there are similarities. And that's why, you know, Spain has been pushing this summit so hard, but the region increasingly sees that if it wants to solve these problems of inequality and lack of access to education and healthcare and potable water and electricity, the way that it can develop itself is by regional integration. That's why Lula in Brazil is talking about creating a new currency for bilateral trade, because according to the US Federal Reserve, 96% of trade in all of the Americas still involves the US dollar. So the countries in the region recognize that after 500 years of European colonialism and neo-colonialism, they clearly have not been lifted out of poverty. In many ways, the situation is getting worse. So the solution is working with themselves to help develop themselves without the meddling of the Western power.
We're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank all of the panelists. It's been a great discussion. Thank you so much. We learned a lot. And thanks for watching another edition of The Heat.